The knock on my door that morning was not just loud. It was the kind of pounding that made your stomach drop, the kind that screamed confrontation. And when I opened it, standing there with her arms folded and a smirk plastered across her face, was Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, holding a printed sheet of paper like it was the Constitution itself, her voice sharp as a blade as she announced, "Your wife owes the HOA $5,500 in fines and late fees, and if it's not paid by tomorrow, there will be consequences." But what Karen didn't know, and what the officer she would later drag into this mess didn't know either, was that the woman she was targeting wasn't just any homeowner's wife. She was a sitting federal judge, and the moment that truth came out, Karen's smug empire of intimidation would crumble before her eyes. And believe me, you're going to want to stick with this story until the very end, because the moment the officer froze when he realized who he was dealing with is pure poetic justice. And if you enjoy watching arrogant people get blindsided by their own ignorance, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to leave you cheering. At first, I tried to be reasonable because it wasn't even me they were going after. It was my wife, Rachel, who had decided months earlier that she wasn't going to let the HOA Nika Lendimas for things that weren't even in the covenants. The $5,500 fine they were screaming about? It started over something as absurd as the shade of our front door paint, which Karen swore wasn't neighborhood appropriate, even though 3 other homes on the same block had doors the exact same color. When Rachel refused to repaint it, they slapped us with a $250 fine. Then came another one about the flowers Rachel planted along the walkway. Unauthorized landscaping, Karen called it. Each time, Rachel pushed back, filing formal responses, citing the bylaws, and demanding proof that these fines were legitimate. Instead of backing off, the HOA board, led entirely by Karen and her little clique, kept stacking fees on top of fees, till the ridiculous total hit $5,500, all while Karen strutted around telling neighbors we were deadbeats who didn't care about rules. But here's the part Karen underestimated. Rachel doesn't just know rules, she enforces them for a living. She's a federal judge who spends her days handing down rulings on constitutional cases and tearing apart weak arguments like a hot knife through butter. And when the HOA started threatening liens, she laughed, tossing the letters aside, saying they wouldn't last 5 seconds in front of me, and they know it. That only made Karen angrier, because the one thing she couldn't stand more than anything else was being ignored. So when Karen showed up at our door waving her notice like a trophy, she wasn't really asking. She was making a show of power. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reviewing case briefs, when Karen launched into her tirade about rules and respect. Rachel didn't even look up. "What? We're not paying your fake fines, Karen," she said calmly, as if swatting a mosquito. That's when Karen's face went beet red and she hissed, "We'll see what the police have to say about that," spinning on her heel and marching away like she'd just won some battle. I thought it was empty bluster, but an hour later, 2 squad cars rolled down the street, lights flashing, pulling into our driveway like we were criminals. Karen stood across the street with her arms crossed, whispering to a neighbor, grinning ear to ear. 2 officers approached, one older and clearly seasoned, the other younger and tense, while Karen trailed behind them like she was their boss. "We received a complaint about unpaid fines and harassment of the HOA board," the older officer said, shifting awkwardly. Stood up slowly, and walked to the door. She wasn't dressed for drama, just jeans and a sweater butt when she spoke. Her voice carried the weight of a courtroom. "Officers, I suggest you take a very close look at the complaint you've just received before you say another word," she said firmly. The younger cop started to rattle off something about civil enforcement, but Rachel held up her hand like she was silencing an attorney mid-argument. "You're here over a private civil matter that has no basis in criminal law. And before you waste more of my time, you should probably understand exactly who you're speaking to." She reached into the drawer by the door, pulled out her federal judiciary identification, and held it out. The room went quiet. The older officer's face shifted instantly, recognition flashing in his eyes, his posture straightening. He looked at the badge, then at Rachel, then at me, then back at Rachel, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Ma'am," he said slowly, You're a federal judge, Karen, who had been leaning forward with smug satisfaction, froze mid-smirk. Her mouth dropped open slightly, her color draining as she took a step back, whispering, "She's what?" Rachel didn't blink. "That's correct. And now I'm going to ask you both a very simple question. Do you want to continue wasting taxpayer resources on Karen's personal vendetta? Or do you want to walk away before you end up in front of me explaining why you thought it was appropriate to get involved in a civil HOA dispute?" The younger cop swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating. The older one cleared his throat. "No, ma'am. This is clearly a misunderstanding. We'll be on our way." But Karen wasn't about to back down, not yet. She screeched. She can't ignore the rules. She thinks she's above the law. Rachel turned to her slowly, her eyes sharp as glass. "No, Karen. I am the law." That was the moment the air shifted, the moment Karen's smug little kingdom started to crack, and while the officers retreated to their cars, and muttering apologies, Karen stood rooted to the spot, staring at Rachel as if she'd just seen a ghost. She had wanted a fight, and instead, she had lit a fuse under a powder keg she didn't even understand. "That's what?" And that right there was only the beginning. Because Karen had no idea just how badly things were about to spiral out of her control. The silence after Rachel's words was thick enough to choke on, the kind of silence where everyone realizes the ground just shifted beneath their feet, and Karen, who had been riding high on her own arrogance, suddenly looked like a childhood. Been caught scribbling on the wall with a permanent marker, her lips quivering. Her voice stammering as she muttered, "You can't just threaten me because of your job." But even she didn't sound convinced of her own protest. And Rachel, calm as ever, crossed her arms and tilted her head as if she were addressing a particularly clueless lawyer in her courtroom, saying, "No, Karen, I don't need to threaten you. The law speaks for itself, and you've been trying to weaponize it without even understanding how it works." The two officers were now visibly uncomfortable. The younger one still clutching his notepad awkwardly while the older one tried to soften things by saying, "Ma'am, we'll just note this down as a neighborhood misunderstanding and leave it at that." But Rachel wasn't letting them off the hook just yet. Her eyes narrowing as she asked, "Did you run a call like this through dispatch protocols? Did you even ask whether an HOA fine constitutes a criminal matter before wasting police resources?" The older officer rubbed the back of his neck, sighing, "No, ma'am. We just responded to the complaint as presented," which was enough for Rachel to press harder, her tone razor sharp. "So Karen lied to you, dragged you into a civil dispute, and wasted department resources for her own personal vendetta. Do you realize how serious that is?" Karen's eyes darted from Rachel to the officers, panic creeping in, her control unraveling. "This isn't what she's twisting it. She thinks she can scare everyone with her title," she snapped, but her voice cracked halfway through, betraying her fear. Rachel finally stepped back, as if bored, waving her hand dismissively. "You may leave now, officers. I'll be filing a report about this misuse of public services. And Karen, consider this your only warning. Keep harassing us and I'll be forced to treat your actions not as a nuisance, but as criminal harassment, and I assure you, consequences won't be something you can bully your way out of." The officers nodded quickly, retreating with visible relief, practically jogging back to their cruisers. Karen stood there on the curb, trembling with anger and humiliation. The neighbor she'd been whispering with earlier now slinking back into their house to avoid being caught in the fallout. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe Rachel's authority would finally shut her up. But Karen wasn't wired that way. Losing face wasn't something she could tolerate, and the moment Rachel closed the door, Karen's expression twisted into one of pure venom, whispering loud enough for us to hear through the window, "You'll regret this." Rachel chuckled softly, shaking her head as she returned to her papers. That woman has no idea how far out of her depth she is. Over the next week, Karen doubled down. First came the flood of letters from the HOA, each one more ridiculous. Then the last, accusing us of everything from failure to maintain landscaping to improper holiday decorations. Even though it wasn't anywhere near a holiday, each notice included another bogus fine, and each one went straight into Rachel's file cabinet, where she carefully organized them by date, labeling them as evidence. She wasn't ignoring Karen anymore, she was building a case. But Karen wasn't satisfied with paper threats. 2 nights later, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering while Karen gestured wildly, pointing at our house. She was rallying them, spinning stories about how Rachel was abusing her power and how we thought we were above the rules. By the time I went inside, Rachel already knew. "She's trying to turn the neighborhood against us," she said flatly. "But mob pressure won't hold up in court. Let her dig her hole." And dig Karen did. Within days, she had plastered notices on the community board claiming our home was in default, that we were endangering neighborhood property values, and that the HOA would be pursuing immediate legal remedies. When I tore one down, Karen appeared like a phantom, screeching, "You can't remove HOA property." Rachel walked up calmly, holding the notice in her hand. "This is libel, Karen, and if you post another one like it, I'll make sure you understand what a defamation lawsuit feels like." Karen's face contorted, but for the first time, she didn't have a quick comeback. Instead, she stormed off, muttering under her breath, and that's when Rachel leaned closer to me and whispered, "She's getting desperate." Desperation turned to recklessness a few days later. We received a certified letter claiming the HOA had officially placed a lien on our property. Rachel's eyes gleamed when she read it. "I can't actually do this without court approval, which means this letter is fraudulent. She just committed mail fraud." She photocopied the letter, placed the original in her evidence folder, and said, "This is exactly what I was waiting for." But Karen still wasn't done. The following Saturday, while Rachel was at the courthouse reviewing documents, Karen returned with another stunt. She stood in our driveway, arms raised, screaming for the whole street to hear. "These people think they don't have to follow rules because she's some big-shot judge. We'll show them." I recorded the entire meltdown on my phone, neighbors, peeking through blinds as Karen went on for nearly 15 minutes until I finally told her, "If you don't leave my property, I'll have you trespassed." She sneered, "Call them. They'll believe me, not you." But when the police did arrive again because Karen had called them, something shifted. It wasn't the same officers as before, but the moment Rachel showed them the file she'd been keeping neatly stacked with copies of every bogus notice, recordings of Karen's harassment, and the fraudulent lien letter, the officer's tone changed instantly. One of them looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, if what's in here checks out, you're looking at multiple counts of harassment and possible fraud." Karen's face drained of color. She sputtered, You can't take her side." But the officers were no longer listening to her. Instead, one turned to Rachel respectfully. "Judge, would you like to file a formal complaint?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, and I'll be escalating this through the proper channels." The cops escorted Karen away that day, not in cuffs yet, but shaken and humiliated in front of the neighbors she'd tried to rally. As the patrol cars left, Rachel turned to me with a small smile. "She thinks she's playing chess, but I'm already a checkmate." Karen's meltdown should have ended things, but with someone like her, humiliation didn't diffuse the fire. It only poured gasoline on it, and within days, the whole neighborhood felt the ripple effects of her obsession. Flyers appeared in mailboxes claiming Rachel was dangerous, alleging she threatened community members with legal power and warning people to unite before it's too late. Most of the neighbors rolled their eyes, quietly dropping the papers in the trash, but a handful seemed to buy into her fear-mongering. Suddenly cold when I waved at them, whispering among themselves when we passed. Rachel, of course, wasn't rattled. She sat at her desk each evening after court, adding the flyers to her evidence pile, highlighting dates, scribbling notes in the margins, her mind already building the legal domino chain. She's manufacturing a narrative, and the more outrageous it gets, the easier it'll be to dismantle. She said one night, her voice calm but edged with steel, but I could see the toll it was taking on me more than her every walk to the mailbox, every sideways glance from a neighbor, every late-night creak outside, making me wonder if Karen was plotting her next stunt. Sure enough, she escalated again. A week later, I found 2 HOA board members in our driveway with clipboards inspecting the fence line. "Can I help you?" asked, already pulling my phone out. They shifted nervously, one of them mumbling. "Karen told us your landscaping violates Section 14B of the covenants." I pointed at the neatly trimmed lawn, the fresh mulch Rachel had ordered, the pruned hedges that look like something from a home magazine. Does this look like a violation to you? They hesitated, exchanged looks, then quietly left, clearly uncomfortable being Karen's pawns. When I told Rachel, she just smirked. Good, now she's roping others in. That's conspiracy to harass, not just personal vendetta. She's making my case stronger. But Karen must have sensed her grip on the neighborhood slipping, because her next move was designed to shock everyone. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, while kids were riding bikes and families were out walking dogs, Karen dragged a folding table into the cul-de-sac, stacked it with printed papers, and announced she was holding an emergency HOA meeting. Neighbors reluctantly gathered, curious but wary, and I watched from our porch as Karen dramatically read out loud, "These people owe the association $5,500 in unpaid fines. They're refusing to comply. If we let them get away with this, what's next?" Chaos. Her voice carried down the street, dripping with fake righteousness. But when she finished, the silence that followed wasn't supportive, was skeptical. One neighbor raised his hand, asking, "Do you actually have proof of these violations?" Karen bristled, waving a stack of her self-written letters. "The notices are proof." Another neighbor spoke up, "But none of us have seen anything." Wrong with their property. "It looks better than half the houses here." Karen's face flushed crimson. "You're blind. They're manipulating you with their status." That's when Rachel stepped out of the house, walking calmly down the driveway, holding a slim binder in her hand. The crowd parted slightly, their eyes drawn to her presence. "Neighbors," Rachel began, her voice measured, authoritative. "I understand you're being misled. Let me clarify a few things. First, these so-called fines, they were never voted on by the board properly. They're void. Second, Karen has been manufacturing notices without legal authority. That's fraud. And third, she's been using police resources to pursue her personal vendetta. That's harassment. Every claim she's made, I've documented. Every letter, every notice, every word is in this file." She held the binder aloft, then flipped it open to show the first page of police report with Karen's name on it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen sputtered, "She's lying, don't listen to her." But the neighbors were no longer fooled. Some began shaking their heads, muttering, while others walked away outright, leaving Karen standing at her little table, her emergency meeting collapsing before her eyes. Rachel handed me the binder and whispered, "Keep recording. This is evidence too." Karen's tantrum reached a breaking point. Then she kicked over the table, scattering papers into the wind, screaming, "You'll all regret siding with her," before storming back into her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled windows. That night, I expected Karen to lick her wounds quietly, but instead she escalated in the most reckless way yet. Around midnight, as we were winding down for bed, headlights swept across our living room window. I peeked through the blinds and saw Karen standing at the curb, flashlight in hand, taking pictures of our house. "She's trespassing," I muttered, reaching for my phone, but Rachel stopped me. "No, let her dig deeper. Keep recording." So I filmed as Karen crept along the side of our property, snapping photos of our yard, the fence, even peering into our windows like some deranged stalker. Rachel called out through the door, her voice calm but cutting. "Karen, this is the last time I'll warn you. You're trespassing. The footage will be submitted in court." Karen jumped, cursed under her breath, and scurried back across the street, but the damage was already done. Rachel saved the footage to multiple drives, labeling it Exhibit C. By the next morning, the story was spreading. Neighbors who had stayed neutral were now openly disgusted, whispering about Karen's midnight antics, questioning her mental state. Even her allies on the HOA board started to distance themselves. But if Karen had any sense of shame, she didn't show it. The very next day, she unleashed her nuclear option. We received a notice taped to our door, an official-looking document, with the HOA letterhead, claiming we were being sued in civil court for refusal to comply with community standards and demanding immediate payment of all fines, plus legal fees. Rachel examined it, her expression unreadable. then let out a short laugh. This isn't filed anywhere, it's a fake. She forged a legal document. I felt my blood boil. That's it. She's gone too far. Rachel's eyes glinted. No, this is perfect. She just crossed into felony territory. Forging court documents is a federal crime. She placed the forged notice into a protective sleeve, adding it to her growing arsenal, then picked up the phone. It's time to escalate. She wanted a war, she'd get one. Watching Rachel work was like watching a chess grandmaster dismantle a reckless amateur. Every piece Karen moved, Rachel had already anticipated. And now, with Karen forging legal documents, the game was no longer just neighborhood drama. It was a legal battle with real consequences, one that Karen had no idea she'd already lost. The forged lawsuit notice was the last straw, not just for us, but for the system itself. Because now Karen had moved from petty harassment into outright felony territory, and Rachel knew exactly how to respond. She gathered all the evidence, every fake notice, every flyer, every video recording, every police report, and organized them into a meticulous timeline, complete with annotations, statutes violated, and cross-references that only a sharp legal mind could weave together. She didn't just build a case. She built a legal fortress, one that would stand even if Karen somehow dragged this into an actual courtroom. I watched as Rachel burned the midnight oil. Her office filled with the glow of a desk lamp and the steady hum of the printer spitting out document after document. I offered to help, but she shook her head gently. I need you rested. I can fight her in the legal arena, but you're the one who keeps this house running while I do it. It's just as important. It was humbling watching her work with that much discipline, and it made me both proud and furious that a federal judge had to waste her evenings countering the antics of a suburban tyrant with a personal vendetta. But Rachel wasn't just fighting for us. She was making sure Karen never had the chance to do this to anyone else again. The next morning, Rachel drove to the county clerk's office with her evidence binder. She filed an official complaint of forgery, fraud, and harassment, attaching copies of every piece of evidence. The clerk raised an eyebrow when he skimmed through the forged lawsuit notice, shaking his head. This is serious. You'll want to involve law enforcement right away. Rachel smiled calmly, as if she had been waiting for that sentence. Already in motion, she said. And she was. By the afternoon, she had called the local police department, the district attorney's office, the state attorney general's office, leaving each with neatly packaged files. Within 24 hours, Karen's little stunt with the fake lawsuit had shifted from neighborhood gossip to an official criminal investigation. But Karen, oblivious to how much trouble she was already in, kept playing her game as if she were. Still in control, she paraded around the neighborhood, loudly telling anyone who would listen that we were being taken to court and finally punished for our arrogance. Some neighbors avoided her, unwilling to get sucked into the drama. But a few still nodded along, either out of fear of being her next target or out of genuine gullibility. I filmed one such interaction from our porch, catching Karen boasting to a young couple about how we were deadbeats who would soon be evicted. Rachel reviewed the footage later that evening, nodding. Good, that's slander, added to the record. The irony was that Karen's every step forward only pushed her deeper into the pit she was digging. Within a week, 2 detectives arrived at our house, politely introducing themselves and asking to review the evidence. Rachel welcomed them in, handing them the binder as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. They sat at our dining table for nearly 2 hours, flipping through pages, watching video clips, exchanging glances that told me they were both baffled and impressed. When they left, one of them shook Rachel's hand and said, "We'll be in touch soon. Thank you for being so thorough, Judge." That word "judge" hung in the air like a thunderclap, and I couldn't help but notice the small smile on Rachel's face. She didn't use her title often outside of work, but in moments like this, it carried weight. A few days later, Karen got her first taste of real consequences. Patrol car pulled up in front of her house, and 2 uniformed officers knocked on her door. Neighbors peeked through curtains, kids whispered on their bikes, and the entire street seemed to hold its breath as Karen stepped out, her arms crossed, her mouth already running a mile a minute. The officers stayed calm, asking her about the forged lawsuit notice. But Karen only grew louder, insisting, "I have the authority as HOA president." Her voice carried across the street, shrill and desperate, but the officers weren't buying it. After nearly 20 minutes, they left without arresting her yet, but the damage was done. For the first time, Karen wasn't the one calling the cops. She was the one being questioned by them. The sight of her standing red-faced on her porch, neighbors whispering and pointing, shattered the aura of control she had tried so hard to maintain. That night, however, we realized Karen wasn't going to back down quietly. Around 10 p.m., our doorbell rang. When I checked the camera, I saw Karen standing there with 3 other HOA board members, holding clipboards and papers. Rachel opened the door just enough to speak, but didn't invite them in. Karen announced in her most theatrical voice, "We're here to deliver a final notice of fines and penalties before foreclosure proceedings begin." Rachel raised an eyebrow, took one look at the papers, and said flatly, "This is a forgery." "Again, you're all complicit now." She held up her phone, showing that she was recording the entire exchange. The board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other with clear regret for following Karen down this path, but she kept pushing, waving the papers like they were holy writ. Rachel ended it with one sentence that made everyone freeze. "I am a sitting federal judge, and you are handing me fraudulent legal documents. Think very carefully about your next move." Silence. Now the board members dropped their eyes, muttered excuses, and quickly walked away, leaving Karen sputtering on our porch before storming back across the street. From that moment, the neighborhood began to fracture. Some residents openly voiced support for us, stopping by to apologize for not speaking up sooner. Others distanced themselves from Karen entirely, avoiding her calls and skipping her emergency meetings. But the most telling sign was when I overheard one of her supposed allies tell another neighbor, "She's going to get herself arrested if she doesn't stop." Karen, however, didn't stop. Instead, she doubled down yet again. She called another HOA meeting, demanding everyone attend, and this time she tried to portray herself as the victim. She claimed Rachel was abusing her judicial power. We were corrupting the neighborhood with threats of lawsuits, that if people didn't rally behind her, they'd all suffer next. But by then, no one was buying it. The turnout was sparse, and even those who showed up weren't nodding along like before. Rachel didn't attend. She didn't need to. She knew the investigation was already moving, and Karen's desperate theater only made her look more unhinged. The breaking point came when Karen finally realized the police weren't taking her side anymore. She tried calling 911 again one evening, claiming we were harboring dangerous contraband because Rachel had installed security cameras around the property. When officers arrived, Karen marched over, demanding they cite us for violations. Instead, the officers turned to Rachel, greeted her respectfully as judge, and asked if she'd like to press charges for harassment. Karen's face drained of color as the realization sank in. The cops she once used as her personal enforcement squad now saw her as the problem. She sputtered, stammered, and then stormed off without another word, the officers shaking their heads as they left. That night, Rachel finally leaned back in her chair, closed the binder, and said, "It's only a matter of time now." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that once the DA's office finished reviewing the evidence, Karen would likely face charges not just for forgery, but also for harassment, fraud, and potentially even obstruction. "She built this house of cards," Rachel said, her voice low but resolute, "and it's about to collapse on her." What neither of us knew yet was just how spectacularly it would collapse, or how quickly the entire neighborhood would turn once Karen's mask was ripped off completely. The calm after Karen's failed 911 stunt didn't last long, because within a week, her world began unraveling faster than either of us anticipated. Early Monday morning, just as I was brewing coffee, I spotted 2 unmarked cars parking near her driveway. From our front window, I watched plainclothes investigators step out, clipboards in hand, and walk straight to her door. Karen answered in her usual robe, hair in disarray, and for the first time I saw her body language tilt, not toward arrogance, but toward genuine fear. They spoke briefly before following her inside, and though we couldn't hear what was said, the sight of law enforcement entering her home while neighbors looked on was a moment no one in the subdivision would forget. Whispers began circulating almost immediately. Some residents lingered on sidewalks pretending to water plants or check mailboxes, craning necks to catch a glimpse. Rachel calmly sipped her coffee beside me and murmured, "This is just the beginning." By midday, word had spread that the investigators had left Karen's house carrying boxes of files, laptops, and what looked like financial records. A neighbor later told me that Karen's husband had been seen looking pale, pacing the porch, while muttering into his phone. For years, Karen had terrified people into compliance with her faux authority, but now the neighborhood buzzed with rumors that she was the one under scrutiny. Later that evening, one of the officers returned, knocking at our door to clarify a few details. Rachel invited him in and handed him an updated copy of her evidence binder, which now included video footage from the last HOA visit where Karen and her board tried delivering fraudulent foreclosure papers. The officer nodded approvingly, saying, "Judge, this is the cleanest case file I've seen in months. You've essentially done half our job." I almost laughed at the irony. Karen, who had been so obsessed with control, had inadvertently pushed her nemesis into building a bulletproof case against her. But Karen wasn't finished causing trouble. 2 days later, she called another emergency HOA meeting, plastering notices on mailboxes like propaganda flyers. Rachel refused to go, but I attended, partly out of curiosity and partly to make sure. We knew exactly what she was saying. The meeting was chaos from the moment it started. Karen stormed into the community center, hair styled stiffly, voice booming. She slammed a folder onto the table and began shouting about how we were destroying the neighborhood and abusing judicial connections to silence honest HOA governance. The room, however, wasn't with her. Neighbors exchanged skeptical glances, a few whispered under their breath, and several openly challenged her. One elderly gentleman stood and asked, "Karen, are the police investigating you? We saw the cars." That single question shifted the entire atmosphere. Karen's face turned crimson as she stammered, "That was a misunderstanding. They're helping us, not investigating me." But the doubt was already planted. Mother of two, who had once been one of Karen's loyal supporters, raised her hand and asked why their HOA fees had mysteriously increased while services, like lawn care and maintenance, had declined. Karen dodged the question, growing more shrill, but her supporters were dwindling fast. By the end of the meeting, it was clear Karen had lost control of the room. Several board members quietly slipped out, unwilling to stand beside her meltdown. I left the meeting with my phone filled with recordings, and when I showed Rachel later, she shook her head and said, "This is self-destruction in real time." The investigation picked up momentum after that. Detectives returned twice more to speak with residents who had been harassed by Karen in the past. Each testimony added weight to the mounting case. We learned that one neighbor, an elderly widow, had been threatened with foreclosure for having a cracked garden gnome in her yard. Another family had been fined repeatedly for overgrown grass. Despite paying for a professional landscaper, Karen's cruelty was systematic, and now it was being documented. Rachel compiled these stories into affidavits, ensuring they were filed alongside her own complaint. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about exposing Karen for the tyrant she had been to everyone. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior spiraled further. One evening, as I was locking up, I noticed her pacing across her driveway, phone glued to her ear, gesturing wildly. Fragments of her shouts carried across the street. "They can't do this to me. I'm the president. I control this neighborhood." A few days later, she attempted to distribute flyers, declaring Rachel unfit to serve as a federal judge, and urging neighbors to petition for her removal. This move backfired spectacularly. Not only were the flyers riddled with typos, but residents were tired of her antics. Most tossed them straight into recycling bins, and a few even brought them directly to Rachel as evidence of ongoing harassment. Rachel calmly filed them into the binder, noting every page she hands me is another nail in her own coffin. The tipping point came one Saturday morning. Karen, clearly rattled by dwindling support, decided to confront Rachel directly. She marched onto our porch uninvited, waving a piece of paper, shouting about final penalties and foreclosure. Authority. I stepped out, phone recording, and told her firmly to leave. Instead, she shoved the paper toward Rachel, who had come to the doorway by then, and shouted, "I'm putting you out of this house." Rachel didn't flinch. She glanced at the paper, recognized immediately that it was yet another forgery, and said calmly, "Karen, you've just committed another felony, and it's on video. Leave now before I call the police myself." For the first time, Karen hesitated. She looked at the camera in my hand, back at Rachel's unshakable expression, and for a moment I saw fear flicker in her eyes. She muttered something incoherent, and stormed off, nearly tripping as she went down the steps. That night, a police cruiser rolled slowly down our street, spotlight sweeping across Karen's house. It parked briefly in front, then moved on. But the message was clear. She was on their radar now more than ever. The neighbors whispered, children giggled, and the illusion of her untouchable authority had completely shattered. Rachel and I spent that evening in quiet reflection. "Oh." She looked at me over a glass of wine and said, "It's amazing, isn't it?" She thought she could scare us into submission with threats and forged documents, but all she's done is hand me the evidence I need to end her reign. I nodded, thinking about the months of chaos Karen had inflicted on us and others, and I realized she had underestimated the one thing you should never underestimate: a woman with the land, the truth on her side. The next week would bring the climax of this saga, one that neither Karen nor the neighborhood would ever forget. Because when the hammer finally dropped, it wasn't just about an HOA fine anymore. It was about a federal judge demonstrating, once and for all, that justice is blind, but it is never powerless. The days following Karen's porch confrontation felt like the calm before a storm, because although she had retreated into her home, her desperation was only tightening around her like a vice. And Rachel knew it was only a matter of time before Karen would do something reckless again. The first sign came when envelopes began appearing in neighbors' mailboxes, all stamped with a makeshift HOA seal and signed under Karen's name. They were laughably unprofessional, printed on cheap paper, filled with threats of outrageous fines, warnings of imminent foreclosure, and even bizarre accusations about residents being unfit community members. One of our neighbors, who worked at the county recorder's office, brought her letter straight to Rachel and asked, "Is this even legal?" Rachel barely had to glance at it before responding, "Not even close. This is another criminal act." That evening, she contacted the investigators, who immediately added the fake notices to the ever-growing case file. What Karen thought was intimidation had instead become the rope she was steadily using to hang herself. At the same time, her home became a fortress of paranoia. Curtains were perpetually drawn, and she and her husband were rarely seen outside except for hurried trips to their car. The once confident woman who used to march down streets inspecting lawns and lecturing residents was now reduced to a recluse, watching nervously from behind blinds. Still, she hadn't lost her obsession with Rachel. Caught glimpses of her, standing in her upstairs window, staring directly at our home, as though plotting her next move. It was unsettling, but Rachel remained unfazed. She reminded me calmly, people like her self-destruct when exposed to the light. Just have to. Keep documenting everything. And so we did. Then one Tuesday afternoon, the storm finally broke. A police cruiser pulled up outside Karen's home, followed by two unmarked sedans. This time, they didn't just knock, they entered with a warrant. For nearly 3 hours, they combed through her house, carrying out more boxes, computers, and even her phone. Neighbors gathered in clusters along the sidewalks, whispering in astonishment as Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, hurling insults at the officers. Her shrill protests carried across the street. "This is harassment. I'm the president of this neighborhood. You'll regret this when I take you to court." But the officers ignored her tantrum, professional and methodical as they escorted her husband into one of the cars for questioning. The spectacle was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen, and by the time the cars drove away, Karen's so-called authority had been ground to dust. Later that evening, a detective called Rachel to update her. They had uncovered evidence of misappropriated HOA funds, thousands of dollars unaccounted for, siphoned into personal accounts under Karen's management. The fraudulent fines and foreclosure threats had been her cover, a way to pressure residents into paying inflated dues that she then diverted for herself. What had started as a petty feud over a $5,500 fine had now ballooned into a full-blown criminal investigation involving financial fraud, forgery, and harassment. Rachel listened calmly, jotting notes, and when she hung up, she turned to me with a look of quiet satisfaction. She thought she was untouchable, she said. But the law has a way of finding people exactly where they live. Yet even as her world collapsed, Karen still tried one last desperate maneuver. 2 days after the raid, she attempted to convene another emergency HOA session. Emailing the dwindling list of supporters she still had, her message was filled with paranoia, claiming that Rachel had manipulated federal resources to frame her and that outside forces were conspiring against the neighborhood. Hardly anyone showed up. Those who did told us later that the meeting was a circus, with Karen pacing the floor, sweating profusely, and ranting about conspiracies. When one board member dared to suggest she step down for the good of the community, Karen flew into a rage, screaming that she would never surrender. That was the moment most of her remaining supporters finally walked away, leaving her isolated in the echo of her own fury. But the true climax arrived a week later. Rachel had just returned from Chambers when there was a knock at our door. 2 U.S. Marshals stood outside, polite but firm. They weren't there for us. They were there to inform Rachel, as both a resident and a federal judge, that Karen was officially being indicted on multiple counts. They explained that the charges included fraud, wire fraud, forgery, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds, all of which carried serious penalties. Rachel thanked them, then closed the door and looked at me with a small, tired smile. "It's over," she whispered. And for the first time in months, I truly believed it. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to the sight of Karen being escorted from her home in handcuffs. A news van had even arrived, tipped off by someone inside the department. And the cameras captured every moment as Karen shrieked about conspiracies and corrupt judges while being placed into the back of a squad car. Her husband trailed behind, silent and defeated. The footage aired that evening, and our once peaceful subdivision was suddenly the subject of local headlines. HOA president arrested on fraud charges. For the neighbors who had lived under Karen's tyranny for years, it was a moment of collective catharsis. People who had been too afraid to speak now openly discussed the harassment they had endured. Families who had been fined unjustly swapped stories, and one by one they thanked Rachel for standing firm when so many others couldn't. Rachel, ever humble, simply replied, "Justice doesn't always come quickly, but it always comes." In the days that followed, the HOA board voted unanimously to dissolve Karen's presidency. New leadership was elected, composed of neighbors who had grown tired of the abuse and wanted nothing more than to restore peace. The first decision of the new board was to audit every financial record and return misappropriated funds to residents, where possible. It was a long process, but the community rallied together in a way it hadn't in years, united not by fear, but by relief. Karen, meanwhile, sat in custody awaiting trial. Rumors circulated that she was attempting to negotiate a plea deal, but no one seemed particularly interested in her fate anymore. For us, the ordeal had ended the moment she was taken away in that squad car. Rachel could finally relax, free of the constant harassment, and the house that had once felt like a battleground returned to being a sanctuary. Yet as we sat on the porch one evening, watching children ride bikes down the street without fear of Karen's surveillance, Rachel turned to me and said, "This should be a reminder to everyone. Authority is not power, and intimidation is not law. People like Karen rise because others are too afraid to stand against them. But the moment someone does, they crumble." I knew she was right. Karen's downfall wasn't just about a fraudulent fine or a judge refusing to be bullied. It was about the power of truth over lies and integrity over intimidation. What none of us realized then, however, was that Karen's saga wasn't entirely finished. There would be one last twist, one final moment, where her name would return to our neighborhood in a way no one expected. And it would test everything Rachel believed about justice, mercy, and closure. But that, as I would come to learn, was waiting just around the corner. When Karen was hauled away in handcuffs, the neighborhood erupted with a sense of relief unlike anything I had ever seen, and for a time, it felt as though the nightmare was over. The shadow that had loomed over every driveway and front porch finally gone for good. Neighbors stopped us during evening walks to thank Rachel. It's not just for her position as a federal judge, but for the courage she had shown in refusing to yield when Karen tried to twist the law to her own advantage. For the first time in years, the block looked alive as Gen kids laughed while riding bikes. Families had barbecues without being policed over noise complaints. Porch lights flickered as friends visited one another without fear of Karen. Reports being logged. It was as though the community had collectively remembered what it was like to live without oppression. And the mood was lighter than it had been in a decade. But Rachel, ever pragmatic, reminded me, don't mistake her silence for an ending. She may be locked up, but people like Karen don't just disappear. They find ways to linger. And in time, I would see how right she was. 3 weeks later, a thick manila envelope arrived in our mailbox. It was addressed to Rachel with no return address, and inside were documents that made my stomach tighten. Karen, from her jail cell, had filed a civil motion. Yes, against Rachel personally, alleging abuse of judicial authority and malicious targeting. It was absurd, the kind of thing any competent attorney would laugh out of court, but it was enough to stir whispers. The local news even ran a short segment about it, portraying it as a desperate last gasp from a disgraced HOA president. But still, the sight of her name crawling across the bottom of the TV screen was enough to remind us she wasn't fully gone. Rachel dismissed it calmly, explaining to me that federal judges face frivolous lawsuits all the time, but I saw the weariness in her eyes. It wasn't the legal threat that bothered her, it was the reminder of just how far Karen's obsession had gone. How deeply her need for control had infected her mind. The hearing over Karen's civil motion was mercifully brief. A judge reviewed the paperwork, dismissed it immediately, and sternly warned Karen's newly appointed lawyer about wasting the court's time. But that brief moment reopened wounds in the neighborhood. People began to wonder aloud, what if she comes back? What if the charges don't stick? Some worried her husband might return and try to pick up where she left off. It was a strange mix of closure and unease, and it reminded me that scars don't fade overnight. Rachel handled it with her usual grace, reassuring anyone who asked that justice was moving forward and that the law wasn't on Karen's side. But she also made a point to tell me in private, the worst damage Karen did wasn't financial, it was psychological. She trained this community to live in fear. It's going to take longer to undo. As Karen's criminal trial loomed, the media attention swelled. Cameras appeared outside the courthouse, reporters dug into HOA corruption, and suddenly our once quiet subdivision became a case study in what happens when power goes unchecked. Karen, escorted into hearings in an orange jumpsuit, no longer looked like the imposing woman who used to bark orders at residents. She looked small, defeated, and fragile, though her glare toward Rachel never softened. At one point during a recess, she locked eyes with Rachel across the courtroom, mouthing something neither of us could quite hear, but the venom was unmistakable. Even in shackles, Karen was still fighting ghosts of her own creation. The trial itself was a meticulous unraveling of her empire of lies. Witnesses from the neighborhood testified about fraudulent fines, harassment, and intimidation. Accountants presented evidence of embezzled HOA funds. Prosecutors painted her as a woman intoxicated by power, desperate to maintain control at any cost. When Rachel took the stand, she spoke not as a judge, but as a resident, describing calmly and factually how Karen had manipulated her position to target us and others. The jury listened intently, and when Karen's defense tried to suggest Rachel had overstepped by leveraging her position, the courtroom fell silent as Rachel explained with precision that every action she took had been as a homeowner defending her family, not as a federal judge. It was devastating testimony, and by the time she stepped down, I could tell even Karen realized the walls were closing in. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on multiple counts of fraud, harassment, and misappropriation of funds. The judge presiding over the case, with an almost poetic finality, sentenced Karen to several years in prison, with restitution to be paid back to the homeowners she had wronged. The courtroom buzzed with a sense of justice delivered, but Rachel only exhaled softly, taking my hand and whispering finally. Karen erupted at that moment, shouting incoherently about conspiracies, corruption, and revenge. She had to be escorted out of the courtroom as her voice cracked and her threats echoed down the hallway. It was a dramatic but fitting end to the saga that had consumed our lives. The neighborhood slowly settled into a new normal. A new HOA board, composed of level-headed, fair-minded residents, worked tirelessly to repair the damage Karen had caused. They hosted community gatherings, waived illegitimate fines, and rebuilt trust brick by brick. Our home became a symbol of resilience, not because Rachel was a judge, but because she had refused to be intimidated into silence. Even neighbors who had once been distant began stopping by to chat, grateful that the dark cloud was finally gone. It was a healing process, slow but steady. And for the first time in a long while, I could look out across our block and feel pride instead of dread. Still, the story didn't just fade away. Reporters continued to call, and documentaries about HOA abuse began mentioning our ordeal as an example of how corruption thrives when unchecked. Rachel agreed to one interview, careful to focus not on herself, but on the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked. She ended that interview with a line that stuck with me. The law is not a weapon for bullies. It's a shield for the innocent. It's something Karen never understood. That quote ended up circulating widely, shared online, and for weeks afterward, neighbors would smile and repeat it to her like a badge of honor. In the end, Karen's downfall wasn't just about her losing her grip on our neighborhood. It was about the reminder that authority doesn't equal power, and threats crumble in the face of integrity. She had tried to weaponize fear, but fear lost its grip the moment Rachel chose to fight back. And though Karen may have thought herself a queen ruling over her tiny kingdom, the truth was revealed for everyone to see. She was just another bully who believed her lies could outlast justice. They couldn't. And so our lives returned to something resembling peace. There would always be echoes of Karen in the memories of our neighbors, reminders of the absurdity we endured. But there was also newfound strength. We had lived through tyranny on a suburban scale, and we had come out stronger, united, and wiser. Rachel was right. Scars remained, but so did the lesson. Authorities borrowed. Integrity is eternal. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want you to take something with you. Never let intimidation silence you. Never let fear dictate your choices. And always remember that even the loudest bully can't outlast the truth. And if you want to hear more stories like this about standing up to Karen's HOAs and the wild twists that life throws, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because there are plenty more battles and plenty more victories to share.